Okay, good evening, everybody. For AP Government, we're going to go over the notes on the first section of the chapter entitled The Constitution. We're going to talk a little bit about the formation of the Constitution as it revolves around the philosophy that the Founding Fathers were trying to follow. Later on, we'll talk about the actual concrete part of the Constitution and go from there. The important part to remember for the AP Government exam is that they're not going to really cover all that much about the causes of the revolution or anything like that. The only time that you would need to know the causes of the revolution for the AP Government exam is how it relates to the Declaration of Independence and the problems that the Founding Fathers were trying to solve. So in that first section of notes there, it talks about injustices that were brought against the colonists in terms of their relationship with the King of England. So it talks about the right to bring cases to independent judges. The judges were all served at the whim of the king, and so if the judges made a decision that the king didn't like, they could be gotten rid of. And so the Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that they had an independent judiciary. The right not to have British troops quartered in private houses, not only quartered in private houses, but they were also, when they were talking about quartering of troops, also that town supplies and town resources went towards the support of the military whenever the military was in town, and those who had given food or given supplies to the military, shop owners, business owners, couldn't get those funds back. And the right to have to pay taxes without direct parliamentary representation. The revolution, this is key, the revolution was not about taxes. It wasn't about paying taxes. It was about having to pay taxes where they didn't have representation. It was the representation part that was important because those taxes could be levied against any institution, they could be levied against any product, they could be used for whatever means the king saw necessary, they could be as high as the king wanted them to be, and since the colonies didn't have a representative in Parliament, then they were shut out of the entire process. So keep in mind that the revolution was really not about taxation, it was more about that without representation part of the slogan. The British Constitution, as we've spoken about in the past, was unwritten, and so the Constitution could be changed at any time with no approval of the people who had to live under it. Good for the king, bad for the colonists. And so you want to make sure that you keep track of why the Constitution in America was written out, and that the framers were using the Constitution as a means of limiting government, not telling the people what the government could do to them. Take special note of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, but we have covered them quite a bit. And underneath section E there, the real revolution of part 1, they're paying attention to what those philosophers, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, are all saying about personal liberty and the relationship that a person has with their government, and that the government should represent the people. And so the founders were really looking for a legislative branch that could be the people's branch, but they were looking for a written constitution to have limits over what that government could actually do. By 1776, 8 states had adopted state constitutions. The other states didn't go without any set of laws. What they did was they just used their old colonial charters as the basis for their own government. And so as we can see later on the second page, where under the Constitutional Convention they're talking about Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, those states had a lot of power to the people, but very little control over their own government. And so it was a very chaotic situation, which is what the founders feared. Now, Thomas Paine, who had been advocating for revolution, didn't want that very much at all. In 1781, we established the Articles of Confederation, and under the Articles of Confederation, each state maintained its own sovereignty. It really was a confederation, not a nation, which means that each of the 13 states was independent of each other, and that they would gather together just to decide issues that were important to multiple states. But within those state boundaries, and even outside of those state boundaries when dealing with each other and foreign nations, there was nothing that that original Congress could do in order to prevent states from doing whatever they wanted. And so when we look at this by 1787, we see a lot of problems. That are coming about because states were too independent and that the federal government had no control. So between the time of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and then the Constitutional Convention in 1787, things were really quite chaotic. The national government couldn't tax. The national government couldn't raise an army. The national government couldn't do much other than give its opinion to the states as to what they should do. 9 states were needed out of the 13 to pass anything. But in order to amend the Articles of Confederation, you needed all 13 states to agree. And because the states had very different economic programs, because the states had very different populations, and because they differed very much geography, you were never going to get 13 states to agree on anything. Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, could print money. They could run the post office and they could appoint key officers, but they couldn't call for taxes, couldn't raise a military, couldn't do any of the things that a government needed to do. And so George Washington, who was very concerned about the security of the country, and Alexander Hamilton, who was very concerned about the economics of the country, called for people to meet in Philadelphia, and 12 of the 13 states did respond. Now, James Madison was probably the most educated in philosophy. He and Thomas Jefferson were really students of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and all of them. And so when we call James Madison the father of the Constitution, it's because of his education. In January 1787, the real linchpin, the real trigger to establishing the Constitutional Convention was Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, where a group of former soldiers revolted against the government because they hadn't been paid as they were supposed to. And so they marched against the state of Massachusetts. And so a lot of people were afraid that the state governments were about to collapse. When the convention finally meets in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, very hot summer, 55 delegates show up. Not all of them were very old. Not all of them were very rich. We do have a kind of diverse background among those 55, so you want to make sure that you pay special attention to the details of the delegates. But it's important to note that they kept those meetings secret, because they were afraid that if the people found out what they were up to, that as small parts of the new constitution about the new government was leaked, people would be very afraid of the changes that they were making. And so they all agreed to keep their meetings secret. But documents were kept, and so we do know what happened inside of that convention. The original call for the convention was to fix problems, not to create something new, but after the first 2 weeks they realized that it was too far gone in order to be fixed, and so the Articles of Confederation were scrapped and a new constitution begins to be made. Pay special attention to the difference between the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, and then the compromise that comes about. Notice that in the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, delegates to the new Congress were picked by the people directly. This is one of those things that they wanted to do in order to keep democracy. But in the compromise, the Senate would be chosen by state legislatures, and the House of Representatives would be picked directly by the people. New Jersey wanted one state, one vote. Virginia wanted representation among population, and so the compromise put both of those ideas into a bicameral legislature. Also take note that the Electoral College was a compromise. Some wanted the legislature to pick the president, some wanted the president to be picked directly by the people, which is a debate that we continue to have today. All of these things kind of go together and fit into that philosophy and bring together large states and small states. So it's important that you know the details of Virginia Plan, New Jersey Plan, and the philosophy.